This happened 4 winters ago. It was an unusually mild night for January. No snow, barely a chill in the air. I decided to head out for a walk around 8 p.m. My schedule was all over the place because of shift work, and nighttime walks had become my way of unwinding. For context, I'm a fairly tall guy, pretty athletic, and I was in my late 20s at the time. Walking at night never really bothered me. I felt safe enough in my own neighborhood. The first 20 minutes were uneventful. I passed a row of old houses, a diner that always smelled of grease, and a corner store with flickering neon signs. Then came the start of a stretch of warehouses that bordered the river. The city was unusually quiet. No cars, no pedestrians. I was enjoying the stillness as I made my way toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed over to the other side of town. As I reached the bridge, I noticed someone standing near the far end, partially illuminated by the streetlight. She was the first person I'd seen out that night, and I assumed she was waiting for a ride, maybe an Uber. She wasn't moving much, just shifting her weight from foot to foot and glancing around nervously. As I got closer, she cast a few fleeting glances in my direction, but quickly looked away each time. I thought she might be uneasy seeing someone walking toward her alone at night, so I tried to make myself seem less intimidating. Headphones visible, pace, steady hands in my jacket pockets. When I passed her, I noticed her outfit, a thin jacket that looked too light for the season, ripped jeans, and a bright yellow backpack that looked like it belonged to a kid. She seemed older than I'd initially thought, maybe early 30s, with cropped brown hair and pale skin. Something about her didn't quite fit, but I didn't think much of it. I crossed the bridge and headed toward the park in the city's center. It was eerily empty. Usually bustling with joggers and couples, it now felt hollow under the glow of the decorative lights strung through the trees. I took my usual loop around the park and then began heading back, passing by an old library with its towering stone columns. Turning a corner, I nearly bumped into someone. It was her, the woman from the bridge. Startled, I pulled off one side of my headphones and mumbled an apology. She stepped back, but didn't say a word. She stood under the street light, her head slightly tilted, stealing quick glances at me, just like before. Her behavior set me on edge, but I nodded politely and kept walking. As I approached the next intersection, I noticed movement behind me in the reflection of a shop window. She was following me. I slowed my pace, hoping she'd pass me or veer off in another direction. Instead, she matched my speed. My pulse quickened. I decided to test my theory. At the crosswalk, I hesitated, pretending to check my phone. She stopped too, lingering a few steps behind. I could feel her watching me. When the light changed, I walked briskly across the street. But she darted past me, her strides long and hurried. She stopped a few feet ahead and crouched down, rummaging through her backpack. Her motions struck me as odd, deliberate, yet aimless, like she wasn't really looking for anything. She kept glancing up at me. Her movements were jerky and erratic. The moment the light turned again, I walked quickly, trying to put some distance between us. She didn't follow immediately. But when I glanced back, she was moving again, faster this time. I reached a poorly lit section of the sidewalk near a building with mirrored windows. Glancing at the glass, I saw her reflection. She was sprinting toward me. I spun around just as she came to a sudden halt mere feet away. Her eyes were wide, her breathing uneven. She stared at me, then down at my arms like she was sizing me up. In her hand was something small and dark, but the shadows obscured what it was. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a tense standoff. My heart pounded. I braced myself to defend against whatever she might do. Then, as if on cue, a car passed nearby. Its headlights briefly illuminated us. The moment broke. I shouted, "What do you want?" My voice came out louder than I intended, more desperate than forceful. She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. I started backing away, one step at a time, never taking my eyes off her. She didn't move, didn't say a word. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and walked quickly toward the bridge. When I glanced back, she was still standing there, watching. Then, with an almost casual air, she turned and disappeared down a side street. I made it home without incident, constantly checking over my shoulder to make sure she wasn't behind me. My roommates urged me to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I even tell them? That some strange woman followed me, that I felt threatened but couldn't prove it. It didn't seem like enough. One of my roommates eventually called the cops for me, but by the time they patrolled the area, she was long gone. I never saw her again, but the memory of that night still lingers. The way she moved, the way she watched me. It wasn't random. I was the target of something. What she planned to do, I'll never know. But I've never walked those streets alone at night again. A couple of years ago, I was burned out from city life and desperate for an escape. Work had been relentless, and the constant hum of noise was suffocating. I needed quiet, and I needed it badly. So I did what some people might call reckless. I planned a solo winter camping trip deep in the woods. Just me, nature, and a weekend of silence. I'd grown up camping with my dad and knew my way around the outdoors. To me, this wasn't risky. It was freedom. Out there, I didn't have to glance over my shoulder or walk with my keys between my fingers like I did in the city. The woods felt like the safest place in the world. I drove for hours the surroundings, growing wilder with each passing mile. By the time I parked my car in a secluded lot near a national forest, the sun was already dipping low. With my gear on my back and a map in hand, I hiked deep into the woods, far from any marked trails. I found a small clearing about 4 miles in, nestled between tall pines, and set up camp. It was perfect. Hidden. Quiet. Undisturbed. The first 2 days were everything I had hoped for. I spent my time hiking, watching birds flit between the trees, and just soaking in the stillness. On the 3rd day, I decided to trek a mile to a frozen creek I had spotted on the map. I wanted to try my hand at fishing. The air was so crisp, it felt sharp in my lungs. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots in the snow and the occasional chirp of a bird. When I reached the creek, I silently celebrated my navigation skills and punched a hole through the ice. The fish were biting quickly, and I was thrilled to have caught something to cook back at camp. But as I crouched by the creek to clean my catch, I felt a strange unease. Something was off. At first, I thought it was just the cold getting to me, or maybe the eerie quiet. But then I realized what was bothering me. There was a faint whistling sound coming from somewhere behind me. It wasn't bird song, and it wasn't the wind. It was a human whistle. Slow. Deliberate. A tune. I froze my knife, still in hand. The whistle didn't stop. "Hello," I called out. But the whistling continued. My stomach turned. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, not this far from the road. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted louder this time. Nothing. Just the whistling, growing fainter. Then it stopped. I gathered my gear and bolted back toward camp, leaving the fish behind. My heart raced as I trudged through the snow, constantly glancing over my shoulder. When I reached camp, I didn't waste time lighting a fire. I grabbed my things and started to pack up. But before I could take down the tent, I noticed something in the snow about 50 yards away. It was large, dark, and half buried in the white powder. I cautiously approached my breath, visible in the freezing air. As I got closer, I realized it was the carcass of a moose. Its body was stiff and frozen. A clean bullet wound through one glassy, staring eye. The kill was recent. Too recent. The dread I'd felt earlier returned tenfold. A hunter wouldn't have left the kill here, not without dressing it or marking it somehow. Dragging an animal that size out of the woods would have been nearly impossible without equipment. And the gunshot. I hadn't heard a single one all day. The forest seemed darker, the silence heavier. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't care which direction, just away. By the time I saw the road through the trees, I was out of breath and soaked with sweat despite the freezing air. I found my car, jumped inside, and sped to the nearest motel without looking back. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the whistling and the moose. None of it made sense. The next morning, I called the park ranger's office and told them what I'd seen. The ranger on the other end sounded more annoyed than concerned, but he agreed to meet me and check it out. We rode into the woods on an ATV, the ranger grumbling about illegal hunters the whole way. When we reached the spot where I'd seen the moose, the carcass was gone. In its place was a trail of blood and drag marks leading into the trees. The ranger's demeanor shifted. He became quiet, his eyes scanning the woods like he was expecting something or someone to appear. He insisted on taking me back to my car immediately. As we drove, I mentioned my camp. He hesitated, then asked me to point him toward it. Reluctantly, I did. The unease on his face deepened as we approached. My tent had been slashed open. The rest of my belongings were scattered, covered in blood, and in what the ranger grimly referred to as moose remains. Someone or something had dragged the carcass to my camp. The ranger dropped me off at my car and said he'd file a report. But I never heard back from him. I drove home that day, leaving everything behind. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. What I do know is that I'll never camp alone in the woods again. When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came to visit us from Ukraine. He was full of stories, the kind that made you lean in a little closer. And though he had plenty of wild ones, there was one that stuck with me forever. Back in the late 1960s, he was traveling by train through the Soviet Union, going from his village to visit family in another town. At some point, he had to switch trains, which meant getting off at a tiny, isolated station in the middle of nowhere. When I say station, I mean it was basically just a platform and a wooden hut, surrounded by nothing but forest and an old dirt road. So there he was alone, waiting for his next train. And waiting. But the train never came. Winter was settling in, and as the temperature dropped and the sun disappeared behind the trees, he started to wonder if he was going to have to spend the night freezing his ass off on that platform. Just as he was trying to figure out his options, an old woman appeared from the woods. She wasn't particularly strange looking, just wrapped up in layers with a hunched posture and a scarf tied under her chin. She asked if he was waiting for the train. When he said yes, she shook her head and told him it wouldn't come until the next day. Then she asked if he needed a warm place to stay and offered him a bed and some food at her home, which she said was about an hour's walk away. Now, back then, in that part of the USSR, staying with locals wasn't weird at all. It was actually pretty normal for travelers to get lodging with villagers instead of paying for an inn or waiting at a cold station. And honestly, the thought of sitting in the freezing dark all night wasn't exactly appealing. So, he said yes. They walked together through the woods. But as time went on, John started noticing something wasn't quite right. The walk was taking much longer than she had said, and by the time they arrived at her small 2-story house, 2 hours had passed instead of 1. But by then, he was exhausted, freezing, and hungry, so he didn't question it. Inside the house was dimly lit with oil lamps, and the air smelled of borscht. She warmed up a bowl for him, and as he finally got a good look at his host, something clicked. This wasn't an old woman at all. The face was off too strong, too angular. And beneath the scarf, there was stubble. This was a man, dressed as an old woman. John was too tired to care at that moment. And it wasn't like he could just leave. He was in the middle of nowhere, deep in the forest, and it was pitch dark outside. He finished his soup, thanked the woman, and asked where he would be sleeping. Without saying much, the woman led him upstairs to a small, bare room with just a single bed and a window. The moment he stepped inside, she shut the door behind him and locked it. Something about that felt wrong. John called out, but there was no answer. He stood there in the dark suitcase, still in hand, heart starting to race. But what could he do? He told himself maybe she was just being cautious. Maybe it was a mistake, and that he'd deal with it in the morning. So he set his bag down and sat on the bed, forcing himself to calm down. Then he realized he had to pee. He sighed, got off the bed, and started feeling around in the dark, hoping there was a chamber pot or something he could use. He got down on his hands and knees, reaching underneath the bed. Instead of his fingers brushed against something and solid, something that shouldn't be there. He froze. Then he moved his hand slowly across the object. It was a human body. His entire body went cold in one single moment. Every bad feeling he had about this place suddenly made sense. He stood up so fast, he nearly lost his balance, his mind racing. His first thought was the window. Maybe he could get out that way. He rushed to check, but it was nailed shut. He wasn't getting out that way without making a ton of noise. But he knew one thing for sure. If he stayed in that bed, he wouldn't be alive by morning. And then he got an idea. With shaking hands, he pulled the body out from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with the blanket. Then he crawled underneath the bed himself and waited. Time passed slowly. Every minute stretched into an eternity. Then he heard it. Footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, heavy. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. John watched as a shadow moved toward the bed. He held his breath. Then a sickening thud, and another, and another. John lay there, heart pounding, as the figure swung a heavy crowbar down onto the bed, over and over again. The blows were meant for him. Then the crowbar dropped to the floor, landing right in front of him. Silence. A few seconds later, the figure turned and walked out, shutting the door behind them. John didn't move. For a long time. When he was sure he was alone, he slowly reached for the crowbar, got up, and crept toward the window. He pried at the nails, working as quietly as possible. Every second, an eternity. When the window was finally loose, he hurled his suitcase outside, climbed onto the ledge, and jumped. He didn't care what was below him. He just knew he couldn't be inside that house any longer. He landed hard, but didn't stop. He ran as fast as he could into the field behind the house, heading toward some distant lights. Eventually, he made it to a highway where he flagged down a military truck that gave him a ride to another village. From there, he caught a train and never looked back. He never reported it to the authorities because at that time in the USSR, reporting something like that could easily backfire. Instead, he thanked God he had escaped and made a silent promise to never, ever travel that route again. Last December, I made the classic mistake of trusting GPS over common sense. I was driving back from a holiday party at a coworker's house, and instead of sticking to the main highway, like a normal person, I let my GPS convince me that a shortcut through the back roads was a good idea. It had snowed earlier that day, leaving the roads covered in a thin, icy layer that no amount of salt seemed to touch. By the time I hit the outskirts of town, the storm had started up again, heavy flakes tumbling down, like the sky was trying to erase everything. Visibility was awful, but my car, a trusty sedan, was handling it well enough. The shortcut turned out to be a single-lane road, flanked by thick, dark woods, the kind of road where you half expect to see a "last gas for 50 miles" sign. I told myself it was fine, that this would shave off 20 minutes. But deep down, I knew I should have turned back the moment the pavement gave way to gravel. About 10 minutes in the car, hit a patch of ice. I felt the tires skid, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought I was going to spin out. But then they caught traction again, and I let out a shaky laugh. "See?" I muttered to myself. "Totally fine." The road curved sharply ahead, and as I rounded the bend, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car sliding to a stop, just a few feet away. The figure didn't move. They were just standing there, wrapped in a coat that looked 2 sizes too big, their head bowed against the falling snow. I rolled down my window an inch, the cold air biting at my face. "Hey, are you okay?" No response. I debated honking, but something about the stillness of the figure stopped me. They weren't looking at me, weren't even acknowledging the car. It was like they were frozen, not just physically, but mentally, too. After a few tense seconds, they turned and started walking toward the tree line. "Okay. That's not creepy at all," I muttered, rolling the window back up. I waited until they disappeared into the woods before easing the car forward again. My heart was still racing, but I told myself it was just some weirdo. Maybe a hunter or someone from one of the nearby farms. Then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, leading from the woods to the middle of the road where the figure had been standing. But there were no tracks leading back. None. Just a single line of prints, as if they had appeared out of nowhere. I stared at them for a moment, the snowflakes already starting to fill them in. And then I did what any rational person would do. I got the hell out of there. The road seemed to stretch forever after that. The storm had picked up, and the snow was so heavy now that I could barely see past the hood of my car. Every tree looked like a silhouette of something waiting to jump out at me. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. That's when I saw them again. The same figure standing at the side of the road. This time, their back was to me. But I recognized the coat, the hunched posture. My breath caught, and I slowed down not entirely by choice. My brain felt like it was stalling along with the car. As I got closer, they stepped into the road. "Are you kidding me?" I hissed, slamming on the brakes again. The car fishtailed, but came to a stop just a few feet away. This time, they didn't wait. They started walking, no staggering, toward the car. Their movements were jerky and uneven, like a puppet being dragged by invisible strings. I panicked. My foot slammed down on the gas, and the car lurched forward, swerving around them. In the rearview mirror, I saw them stop and turn, their face finally visible in the dim glow of my taillights. It wasn't right. Their features were pale, almost waxy, and their eyes, if you could call them that, were empty black hollows that seemed to swallow the light. They didn't look angry or scared. They looked wrong, like something that had been made to look human, but didn't quite get it. I didn't stop again. The road eventually dumped me back onto the highway, and I didn't let myself breathe until I saw the familiar lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in, parked under the brightest fluorescent bulb I could find, and sat there for a long time. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. When I finally got out to stretch my legs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh ones, circling the car in a tight, deliberate loop. There was no one else in the parking lot. The snow around me was undisturbed except for those prints. I didn't stay long after that. I made it home in record time, parked my car in the driveway, and didn't leave the house for days. I never told anyone about what happened, partly because it sounds insane, and partly because I'm not sure I want to relive it. Growing up in a small town surrounded by endless woods and winding creeks, you get used to quiet winters. Snow muffles everything, and the world seems frozen in time. For me, the frozen lake just outside of town was the centerpiece of those winters. It was our makeshift skating rink, our fishing spot, our playground. But as I got older, the lake became less of a place to play and more of a place to think. It was peaceful, with only the occasional crow cawing in the distance. That peace was exactly what I needed. Last February, I'd been going through a rough patch. Nothing dramatic, just the usual existential dread of adulthood creeping in. One evening, after a fresh snowstorm, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The sun was setting, and the light was that perfect winter orange that makes the snow glow. I bundled up, grabbed a thermos of hot coffee, and headed out. The lake was about a 20-minute walk from my house, down a winding path lined with bare trees. By the time I got there, the sky had darkened into a deep blue, and the stars were just beginning to peek through. The lake stretched out like a mirror, perfectly still and frozen solid. Snow dusted its surface in uneven patches, and a thin mist hovered around the edges. As I walked along the shore, I noticed a figure in the distance, a man standing in the middle of the ice. He wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still, facing the far side of the lake. At first, I thought he might be ice fishing, though he didn't have any gear. Or maybe he was just enjoying the view. But something about the way he stood, motionless, gave me pause. I stopped and watched him for a moment. He was too far away for me to make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the glowing snow. I thought about calling out, but something told me not to. Maybe it was the eerie stillness of the scene, or maybe it was the way the cold seemed to press in on me all at once. I told myself he was just some guy out enjoying the solitude like me, and kept walking. I followed the shoreline, keeping an eye on him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't move, not even a shift of weight or a turn of his head. It was like he was carved out of ice himself. A shiver ran down my spine, and not from the cold. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the crunch of snow under my boots and the thermos of coffee warming my hands. When I finally glanced back, he was gone. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the lake. The ice was empty. No man. No footprints. Nothing. The air felt heavier, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the span of a minute. My breath came out in sharp puffs, hanging in the air like tiny clouds. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. There was no way he could have left the ice without me hearing. The shore was lined with thick snow, and the sound of footsteps carried far in the quiet. I told myself he'd just walked away while I wasn't looking, maybe heading to the other side of the lake. But when I stepped closer to the edge of the ice, my stomach dropped. There were no footprints leading away. The snow on the surface of the lake was undisturbed, untouched, except for the tracks I'd made along the shore. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to think rationally. Maybe he'd been closer to the center of the lake than I thought, where the snow was thinner. Maybe he'd left through the woods on the far side. But that didn't explain why there were no tracks leading to where he'd been standing in the first place. It was like he just appeared there and then vanished. I backed away from the lake, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. The quiet that I'd found so comforting earlier now felt oppressive, almost suffocating. I hurried back the way I'd come, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there again, watching me. By the time I got home, my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, catching my breath. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just some random guy I hadn't noticed leaving. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. Around midnight, I finally got up and peeked out the window, looking toward the direction of the lake. The snow-covered trees stood silent and dark. The path was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, watching. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I bundled up and headed back to the lake, determined to find some explanation. When I got there, the surface of the ice was completely smooth. No footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Not even mine from the night before. It was like the lake had wiped itself clean. I haven't been back to the lake since. Whatever I saw or didn't see still haunts me. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. But I know what I saw. There was a man on the ice. And then there wasn't. And some part of me knows he wasn't just a man. We had been planning the camping trip for weeks. Just me, my girlfriend at the time, and 3 of my best friends. It was the middle of winter, and we thought it would be the perfect weekend to escape into Cooey State Park, do some hiking, set up camp, and just enjoy being out in nature. We packed up the cars and drove in late Friday night, arriving at the campsite around midnight. It was nearly pitch black, except for the dim glow of the stars above. The whole place felt eerily empty. There were only 2 other groups nearby, a young couple camped a little ways down the road, and an older man staying alone in a camper at the opposite end of the campground. We parked, unloaded our gear, and began setting up our tents. Our headlamps cut through the darkness, the only source of light aside from the occasional flicker from the campfire we had just built. We were joking around, half exhausted from the drive, when my girlfriend suddenly froze. There was someone standing with us. We turned, and sure enough, an extra person had somehow appeared in our group. It was the young woman from the nearby campsite. She looked off. Her eyes were glazed over, her skin pale and blotchy. Small scabs covered her arms like she had been picking at them. She introduced herself in a flat, lifeless voice, and even though she seemed friendly enough, something just didn't feel right. While we talked, we noticed someone else standing at a distance, her boyfriend, or husband maybe. He wasn't far from us, just at the edge of the woods, watching. He never spoke. He barely moved, just stood there, staring. Eventually, he turned and walked back to their site. But a few minutes later, we saw his car pulling up the dirt road toward us. He stopped right in front of our campsite and turned on his high beams. It was blinding. At midnight, in the middle of the woods, having a stranger's headlights blasting into your face is one of the most disorienting things you can experience. My instincts immediately told me something was wrong. The woman quickly mumbled, "I should go," then walked to the car and got in. Without another word, they sped off into the darkness. It was unsettling. But we weren't scared, at least not yet. We just figured they were weird people and tried to shake it off. That changed later that night. I was in my tent with my girlfriend when we heard shouting. It was the couple. What started as an argument quickly escalated into full-on screaming. My friends must have heard it too, because I could hear them shifting around in their tents. Then came the crash. It sounded like glass shattering. My girlfriend and I sat up, suddenly wide awake. We debated whether we should check it out or mind our own business. A few moments later, We heard the car start, then tires spinning in the dirt. The car ripped out of the campsite, tearing down the gravel road right past our tents. We could feel the gravel hitting the fabric. It was like he was trying to prove a point, trying to scare us. We waited. Then he came back. The tires screeched as the car pulled in again, but this time he didn't leave. Instead, we heard 2 loud pops. Gunshots. Everything froze. I didn't breathe. My girlfriend was gripping my arm, and I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I couldn't move. I just listened. Then, after what felt like forever, we heard yelling again. It wasn't panicked. It wasn't someone screaming for help. They were arguing. As crazy as it sounds, I felt a wave of relief. Because if they were arguing, that meant they were both still alive. We stayed completely still until things finally calmed down, sometime around 4:00 a.m. Exhaustion eventually won, and we fell asleep. But it was the kind of sleep where you're half aware of every single sound. By morning, they were gone. When we got up and walked over to where their campsite had been, it was empty. Just scattered ashes from their fire and tire marks in the dirt. We never heard them pack up, never heard them leave. While we were breaking down our own camp, the older man from the camper walked over. He seemed friendly. At first, made small talk, asked if we had a good night. Then he noticed my girlfriend. With a serious expression, he said, "You shouldn't have brought her. It's not safe for women out here." That was it. No explanation. I think we were too stunned to even ask him what he meant. But at that point, we didn't need another reason to leave. We packed up as fast as we could and found another campsite on the other side of the park near a lake. The rest of the weekend was fine, but there was an unshakable feeling of unease. Maybe we were overthinking it. Maybe the couple was just a walking disaster and nothing more, but something about it. The girl's empty expression, the boyfriend's high beams, the gunshots, and the old man's warning stuck with me. I don't think I ever want to go back to that place again.